Man, I fucking love Halloween. I know it might be an unpopular opinion since I'm pretty sure everyone else in the world loves Christmas because of the presents and spending time with your family, and I get that, but I just don't like all the ho 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 bullshit. Like actually, I really hate Christmas movies and music. It's all the same regurgitated horsemanure we get every single year. And you could say that's all about getting into the Christmas spirit, but nah, that's not for me, dude. I love Halloween because it's the complete polar opposite of Christmas. It's a fantastic time to throw in a classic horror film, put that Danzig CD to good use, and get comfy in the Halloween spirit. With that, I'm happy to announce that I'm starting my own video marathon month thing that every game reviewer does. I'm calling it Doomtober. Don't let the name fool ya. It won't just be about retro shooters, it'll be about every spooky game I could get my grubby hands on. Obviously, I could just review any of these games any time of the year, but what's the fun in that? To kick things off with the month, I'll be looking into Dusk, a retro shooter developed by David Szymanski, or Szymanski? I don't fucking know, I'm Polish, give me a break. And published by New Blood Interactive, released in 2018 with really positive reception. And I'll be completely blunt with you, I think it's a little overrated. Look, I've seen footage, clips, trailers for this game, and it all looked really promising. Right off the bat, the atmosphere I was getting, I absolutely could not go wrong with, and it looked like a really fun game. But holy shit, when I played it, it really didn't sell me as well as the 11,000-ish people who gave it a positive review on Steam. I'll get into why I found the game to be underwhelming later since I don't want to start off in a bad mood, so I'll start with all the things I liked. Upon opening up the game, it presented with a fake DOS boot up screen and then a dead guy. Nice. The visual style of Dusk is very clearly a homage to the games that it drew inspiration from. I've heard a lot of people say it looks ugly and the color palette is really dull, but honestly, I don't mind it. I mean, I never really cared how a game looks, as long as it's not like this, and that it plays nice, and well, I've never had an issue with the game's visuals making it hard for me to tell what's what, and in terms of movement, Dusk nailed it pretty well. At first I wasn't a fan of it, it was a little too floaty and weightless for my liking, but I eventually warmed up to it. The floaty movement fits in very nicely with the combat, making almost every enemy encounter, no matter the size, really fast paced. Compared to other shooters, Dusk has a pretty meaty story too. It's not ever the main focus, but bits and pieces of it are brought up fairly frequently, whether it's through text that appears after you finish the chapter, writings on the wall, or the disembodied voice that talks to you as you're playing.
With his sparks, we take from men that which has never been taken before.
The story is that you play as a treasure hunter that goes to a small town known as Dusk, because you've heard rumors that the town has heaps of treasure. Shortly after arrival, you've been kidnapped and almost killed by a bunch of lunatics who've watched a little too much Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You realize the town is run by a cult possessed by a greater being and you try to escape, but the more you try, the deeper you go into the rabbit hole. Seeing the story becoming more and more bizarre the closer I got to finishing the game was really entertaining, especially since the level environments also drastically changed to fit with it. However, my first issue with the game is that you don't get a taste of what's to come until halfway through chapter 2. And I get that you don't want to show all the cool and weird shit at the very start of the game, which I'm completely fine with. But the thing is, the start of the game just doesn't excite me in any way. There's barely anything new here. The level design is the standard key hunt, and hell, even the weapons aren't really that exciting. Like, they're fun to shoot, but they are just so generic. The only thing new here is the crossbow, which can pierce through multiple enemies, and a sword that you get in chapter 3 that is just so busted. It's basically the only thing I use for all of the last chapter of the game. The game also does allow you to move objects around, which is a really neat idea. The only issue with it is that it's never used outside of coming up with really cheeky shortcuts and accessing secrets. I feel like if this aspect of the game was given a much bigger emphasis, it could have made the levels a little more interesting to play through. Rather than just simply getting a blue key and heading over to the blue door, it could have been something like you need to stack a bunch of boxes on top of each other to be able to get to the blue key. It might make the levels a little more confusing, but at least it's something new. Incorporating some light physics-based puzzle elements into the levels isn't something I think too many retro shooters have done in the past. And look, I'm not trying to say every level is uninteresting, because there are a good handful that are actually some of my favorites. E2M5 the Esker Labs is the first taste you get of how weird this game will later become. It starts off as a generic lab, but later transforms into this really confusing geometric mess. The level right after the Airbus reactor is just this giant room filled with enemies and a big ass crater right in the center of it. Then to top it all off, you fight fucking Big John at the end.
Come on, kill me! Come on, kill me!
And my favorite level in the entire game, E3 M7 Homecoming. It's so fucking insane. The entire level is a puzzle where you're constantly shifting gravity around to access islands that are sideways, upside down, downside up. It's nauseating, but I seriously can't even put into words just how fun it is to play through. It's just a shame because Dusk shows these levels off at a point where I'm already bored and just so out of it. And it's not like the game all of a sudden becomes flawless after E2M5. There's still so many moments that just miss the mark for me. One that really grinds my gears is that every time you do something, literally anything from picking up a key to even blinking, 300 enemies will just materialize from thin air. And this isn't anything new or out of the ordinary for a game like this. It's not even hard, it's just that the game does it almost constantly. It's fun for the first few times, but after a while it just becomes so predictable that when it happens, it just never phases me. The penultimate level, the Dweller in the Darkness, is a level where you just shoot through waves of enemies. And normally something like this sounds fun, it sounds thrilling, but with how many enemy hordes I had to shoot through prior to this level, I legit just don't feel anything. I've become so numb to enemy encounters because of how much the game loves to spam them, that something like this is comparable to just zoning out and watching fucking TV static for me. The music that also accompanies you while you're fighting is just metal. And I'm really fucking sorry, but for me, it's just like everything else in the game. Unexciting, uninteresting, bland. The soundtrack was composed by Andrew Hulshult. He's worked on other games like Quake and Rise of the Triad. I'm not super familiar with his work, but from the other stuff I've listened to, it's actually not bad. I just don't know why Dusk's soundtrack just doesn't hit me. I'd like to think that it might be because the game doesn't have a volume slider for sound effects, so when I'm out and about shooting and exploding things, the soundtrack just gets lumped into all that auditory chaos. So for me to properly listen to and review the soundtrack, I had to listen to it on Spotify. And, well, I mean, it does sound better out of game than in game, but I can't for the life of me remember a single track that actually stood out to me apart from a small handful that I don't even know by name. Yeah, the soundtrack got a lot of praise, but at least for me, it's super forgettable. It's metal, but it's not like there's anything special to it. Like, honestly, just try to imagine the most stereotypical sound from metal, and you probably wouldn't be too far off from what it actually is. Alright, so for this next part, I'm going to talk about the final boss fight. Now, normally I wouldn't put up a spoiler warning just because all the boss fights I've gone over in the past weren't all that interesting. However, Dusk is a special case and has a really cool surprise for all you longtime fans of the genre. So if you're actually thinking about buying the game, I'd suggest you skipping to this timestamp, and if not, keep watching. Alright? We good? Cool. Wow, does this boss fight suck ass. There's two phases to it. One is where you fight Jacob, the dude who constantly belittles you throughout the entire game. This fight is pretty okay. And then you've got the Lovecraftian horror, Nyarlathotep. I read a Steam review saying that you could beat the boss by just standing on one bounce pad, and fuck me, they weren't kidding. All you have to do is just shoot at the cracks of light to weaken him, and then just start shooting at him. That's about it. He doesn't have any attacks they have to worry about besides a bitch slap that does barely anything if you get hit by it. So yeah, other than that, he is a ridiculously easy boss. However, one part of it that almost makes up for how disappointing the boss fight is are the cutscenes. I never realized it until my last playthrough of the game that Nyarlathotep is voiced by Stephen Waite. For those of you who are super familiar with retro FPSs, you already know who he is, but for those unfamiliar, he's the legend that provided the voice for Caleb in the 1997 shooter Blood. Don't worry, I'll be going over you in due time. It almost goes without saying that the voice work he provided is seriously phenomenal. Very top-notch stuff. And just the last cutscene, I'll admit, is such a good high note to end the game on.
How does it feel? Horrible, isn't it? But wonderful, yes? Who you were before is insignificant. Who you are now is inconceivable. But here you shall remain till I have need of you again. For one must always reign beneath dust.
To cap things all off, Dusk gets a 6 out of 10. I know it's not the most wonderful way to start off this marathon, but what can I say, gotta save the best for last. I don't want to sound overly pessimistic in this review, but I think ultimately that's what I ended up doing. Look, I can see that Dusk is a fan letter to the games it drew inspiration from, and it's a very well written one too. David Szymanski, or Szymanski, did a really decent job with it, however the game just lacks its own identity. So much of the start of the game is stuff I'm all too familiar with, and when the game gets to the more interesting stuff, at that point it's already too late for me to be really captured by whatever's going on. Not to mention the game still has a bunch of other issues that really bog down the whole experience. Trust me, I've really tried loving this game, and I even wanted to, but fuck, the dull boring moments vastly outweigh the moments where I was actually having fun. There's been rumors floating around about a DLC and a sequel, and if that becomes a reality, I wouldn't be opposed to looking into them. Quite honestly, I'm even curious to know if Dave will bring the game one step further. Seeing as how batshit insane Chapter 3 was, perhaps Dusk 2 will hit the ground running, and if that's the case, I'm all for it.